Hello and welcome everyone to our weekly session titled Latest in Bitcoin Tech, where we go through the Bitcoin Optech newsletter published weekly. And this week we'll go through newsletter number 336, published on 10th of January 2025. This week's newsletter is pretty brief in size. It has only three news articles and a couple of or three release candidates, which obviously don't eat up too much of our time, and probably a couple of core and documentation changes. We'll probably take two news articles out of three because they are more relevant, and probably one code and documentation change. So it'll be a brief session, I believe. I don't think we'll last for one entire hour. We'll probably wind up this session in like 35, 40 minutes. It's quite a brief news letter, one of the shortest I've seen in recent times. So let us begin with the preface. This week's newsletter describes a potential change to Bitcoin Core affecting miners, summarizes discussion about creating contract level relative time locks, and discusses a proposal for an LN symmetry variant with optional penalties. Also included are our regular sections announcing new releases and release candidates and summarizing notable changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure software. Let's start with the first news article that talks about mining. Let's read it first and then try and understand it and discuss it. All right. So the title is Investigating Mining Pool Behavior Before Fixing a Bitcoin Core Bug. Abu Bakr Sadiq Ismail posted to Delving Bitcoin about a bug discovered in 2021 by Antoine Riard that results in nodes reserving 2000 virtual bytes in block templates for Coinbase transactions rather than the intended 1000 virtual bytes. Each template could include approximately 5 additional small transactions if the double reservation was eliminated. However, that could lead to miners who depended on the double reservation producing invalid blocks, resulting in a large loss of income. Ismail analyzed past blocks to determine which mining pools might be at risk. He noted Ocean.xyz, F2 pool, and an unknown miner are apparently using non-default settings, although none of these appear to be at risk of losing money if the bug is fixed. However, to minimize the risk, it's currently proposed to introduce a new startup option that defaults reserving 2000 virtual bytes for the Coinbase. Miners who don't need backwards compatibility can easily reduce the reservation to 1000 virtual bytes or less if they need less. Jay Bedick relayed the message to the mining dev mailing list. Okay. Uh, so what did this article talk about? It primarily talks about a bug in Bitcoin Core and how it impacts template creation for mining pools. All right. So we all know that initially the Bitcoin blocks were of 1 MB in size, right? We call them legacy blocks. So when Satoshi wrote code, uh, and during the initial days of Bitcoin, a Bitcoin block was of 1 MB in size. But in 2017, as most of you must be aware, one of the most popular soft forks happened in Bitcoin, known as a SegWit soft fork, which is preceded by what is known as the block size war. After a lot of back and forth, eventually a soft fork happened in 2017, which activated SegWit. And post activation of SegWit, the weight, I mean, the size of a Bitcoin block was no longer calculated in MBs, rather it was calculated in weight units. Okay, so before 2017, the size of a Bitcoin block was 1 MB, 1 megabyte, right? And we all know what a megabyte is. But post 2017, we started calculating the size of a Bitcoin block in terms of weight units. So now the Bitcoin block was of 4 million weight units. The Bitcoin block was of 4 million weight units. Out of these 4 million weight units, 4,000 weight units were dedicated to Coinbase transaction, right? So if you are creating if you are creating a template, 4,000 weight units were dedicated to the Coinbase transaction. We all know what the Coinbase transaction is, right? It's a transaction that basically pays the miners. It's a transaction that pays the miners the block subsidy, which is currently 3.125, right? It started with 50 Bitcoin, then it reduces with every halving, 25, then 12.5, so on and so forth. Currently, it's 3.125, right? So the transaction, one specific transaction in every Bitcoin block, which is known as Coinbase transaction. It is a transaction that pays the miners the Coinbase reward, the reward for mining the Bitcoin transaction. So 4,000 weight units out of 4 million weight units were reserved for this Coinbase transaction. Now, if you remove 4,000 from 4 million, what are you left with? You are left with 3,996,000, right? So 3,996,000 space was given to you to fill the block with transactions, and 4,000 weight units of space was reserved for the Coinbase transaction. Now, due to a bug in Bitcoin Core, instead of 4,000 weight units, 8,000 weight units were being reserved. Okay. Ideally, what do we want? We want 4,000 weight units to be reserved for the Coinbase transaction. And the rest of the space, which is 4 million minus 4,000, which is 3,996,000, that space is remaining for the miners to fill with other transactions. But due to a bug, instead of 4,000, 8,000, that is double. 8,000 weight units were being reserved for the Coinbase transaction, leaving the miners with only 3,992,000 weight units, right? How does this impact the miners? It obviously impacts the miners because it robs them of or deprives them of 4,000 weight units of space, which they can populate with transactions, right? On an average, a regular size transaction, uh, five such transactions would amount to 4,000 weight units, right? So a miner that is using Bitcoin code to create block templates and is retorting to using Bitcoin cores default policies will have 4,000 weight units less. That is, he will miss out on the fees of 4 to 5 transactions because instead of reserving 4,000 weight units for Coinbase transaction, 8,000 units was being reserved for the Coinbase transaction. This is, I think, known as a double reservation bug. This is known as the double reservation bug. Okay, so how was this fixed? Let's first read through the article, and then we'll look into how this was fixed. I hope the problem statement is clear. The problem statement is that a Bitcoin block amounts to 4 million weight units. The size of a Bitcoin block is 4 million weight units, out of which we reserve 4,000 weight units for the Coinbase transaction, and the remaining 3,996,000 is used for filling it with transactions. Okay. Now, instead of allocating 4,000 weight units, due to a bug, double space was being allocated. That is 8,000 weight units were being allocated, and 3,992,000 weight units were being allocated for the transactions that the miner will mine, meaning the miner was being deprived of 4,000 weight units, which usually is 4 to 5 transactions. So a miner that was using Bitcoin Core's default policy to create block templates for mining was uh not was not able to utilize the entire block space that is available and was able to fill in the block with 4 or 5 less transactions. Okay, so let's say if there are 1,000 transactions, ideally he could have accommodated 1,004 or 1,005 transactions. But because instead of reserving 4,000 weight units, we are reserving double, that's 8,000 weight units, the miner was not able to use that additional 4,000 weight units to populate the block with transactions. So in theory, Bitcoin Core's block building algorithm reserves 4,000 weight units for block header, transaction count, and minus Coinbase transaction, right? So that 4,000 weight units that I just talked about is reserved for these three entities, okay? The block header, the transaction count, okay? So how many transactions are in the block, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 500, whatever, and minus Coinbase transactions. So 4,000 weight units is reserved for these three pieces of information, for the block header, for the transaction count, and the minus Coinbase transaction. This means it should generate a block template with a weight of 3,996,000 weight units. However, in practice, this is not the case due to an accidental double reservation bug. As a result, Bitcoin Core generates block templates with a weight of 3,992,000 weight units, right? Ideally, we want to allocate 4,000 weight units for the block header, for the transaction count, and for the minus Coinbase transaction. But due to a bug in Bitcoin Core, we were allocating double the amount of space. That's 8,000. So a miner should ideally get 3,996,000 weight units to fill with transactions, but he was only getting 3,992,000 weight units. Okay, so he was getting less space than he ideally should, right? And if a miner gets less space, then what happens? They get less fee. There is an ongoing attempt to fix this issue, but there are concerns that fixing the issue could lead to some miners generating invalid block templates. If the PR were to be merged, mining pools using the updated Bitcoin Core version must ensure the sum of the Coinbase transaction weight and the weight of all additional transactions added to the block template must not exceed 4,000 weight units. Otherwise, the block will exceed the consensus limit for the maximum block weight of 4 million weight units and be invalid, right? So one potential fix to it would be what? Would be that we limit the space for a Coinbase transaction to 4,000 weight units, right? That's pretty straightforward. So we limit the space of a Coinbase transaction to 4,000 weight units. But what would happen in that case is that there are miners because currently you can allocate 8,000 vehicles, right? 4,000 is what we intended, but due to a bug, it's been extended to 8,000. Now there are some miners that are using that 8,000. So if you put a hard cap and you say that a Coinbase transaction cannot be more than 4,000 weight units, what happens? Those miners that are creating Coinbase transactions greater than 4,000 units, because currently it's permissible up to 8,000 weight units, right? So what if a miner is using that 8,000 weight units? What if a miner is creating a Coinbase transaction that's 5,000 weight units, that's 6,000 weight units, that's 7,000 weight units? If you put an upper cap of 4,000 weight units overnight, what will happen is that those miners who are creating Coinbase transactions in addition of 4,000 weight units, what will happen? Their block will be invalid. Their block will be invalid, right? Because if they use 3,996 weight units for transactions and then they put a Coinbase transaction that's greater than 4,000 weight units, then the cumulative size of their entire block will exceed 4 million, which is this is like a consensus limit, right? This is not policy. You cannot change it. Any block that is greater than 4 million weight units in size will get rejected. It will not be relayed across the network, right? So you cannot putting a hard cap of 4,000 weight units for the Coinbase transactions might lead to some miners that are creating Coinbase transactions currently of in excess of 4,000 weight units. It not might, it will necessarily render the blocks that they create invalid, right? The proposed PR fixes the double reservation issue, which means the block template size is increased by 4,000 weight units, resulting in blocks with a weight of 3,996,000 weight units as expected and matches theory. Miners or pools needing more than 4,000 weight units for their Coinbase transaction should configure Bitcoin with a lower block max weight option. For example, starting the Bitcoin core with block max weight is equals to such and such 3,999,000 will free up an additional 1,000 weight units. Okay, so what is the remedy? Like for instance, 4,000 weight unit is allocated to your block header and to your transaction count and the Coinbase transaction, right? If you want more than that, uh, you can use this RPC, right? This is the PR that fixes. You can use this RPC and you can stipulate a value less than 4 million, right? So this is 3,999,000. What this does is that it gives you 1,000 weight units additional for your Coinbase transaction. So instead of 4,000 Coinbase transaction, you get a space of 5,000 weight units per Coinbase transaction, right? So if you're a miner who's creating a Coinbase transaction, who is accustomed to creating a Coinbase transaction in excess of 4,000 weight units, because Bitcoin Core up till now was allowing it, and a lot of folks of Bitcoin Core were also allowing it. Right? So uh, how do we ensure backward compatibility, right? Instead of setting a hard cap on the amount of the weight that we can allocate to the Coinbase transaction, we can use this RPC command to manipulate the size of the block, right? So if you use this RPC command and you allotted this value, then 1,000 instead of 4 million, 3,999,000, then you free up 1,000 weight unit of space, which will be allocated for the Coinbase transaction. So if you're a miner that's using Bitcoin Core and its default policy or any of its forks, and you want to create a Coinbase transaction in excess of 4,000 weight units, and at the same time you want to ensure that you don't end up creating invalid blocks, then you can use this. If your Coinbase transaction goes up to 5,000 weight units or 6,000 weight units or 7,000 weight units, just go here and adjust this there. Instead of 99,000, put in 98,000, 97,000, and the more space that you release over here will be allocated to your Coinbase transaction. The purpose of this analysis to examine mining pool behavior and determine the feasibility of this change. Blocks analyzed. So this proposer has analyzed 107,313 blocks from the period of 24th December 2022 to 23rd December 2024. This is the methodology. I've used libbitcoin kernel to read blocks from disk. Each block is deserialized, and Bitcoin data mining pools tags are used to match the block to a mining pool. The block weight, Coinbase transaction, and mining pool information are then saved to disk. After saving the data for the entire block interval, I generated the analysis resulting using the script. Charts were generated using a set of scripts. More details in the methodology can be found here. Okay, so here's a list. Like the proposer analyzed blocks over 100,000 blocks from the period of December 2022 to December 23rd, and he found that the average Coinbase weight of Ocean is 6994, right? So if we put a hard cap of 400,000 weight units for the Coinbase transaction overnight, what will happen? The blocks that Ocean will generate will become invalidated, right? So the more flexible approach is to set it to 4,000 and then allow the miners to free up more space from from their block templates so that they can allocate that space that has been freed up for the Coinbase transactions, right? An unknown pool was using 74320. Okay, this this box plot shows the distribution of Coinbase transaction weights for pools generating blocks with Coinbase weights greater than 4,000 weight units. So you can see Ocean usually generates Coinbase transactions in the range of 6,000 to 7,500 weight units, right? And another unknown pool in the range of 7,000, 7,500 units. And these are some other mining pools. Their average Coinbase weight is 1,000. That's why BTC. Foundry 834 weight units. F2 pool 1,610 units. And pool 1,357 units. Binance pool, Spider, Brain, etc. So most of the mining pools, their Coinbase transactions are less than 4,000 weight units. It's probably Ocean that is the only relevant pool that generates Coinbase transactions in addition to 4,000 weight units. And there might be some anonymous miners, right? Some solo miners who generate that. I think even F2 pool occasionally generates that. So would anyone like to take a shot at why this happens with Ocean? Okay, I'll tell you. So, Ocean, to the best of my knowledge, is the only mining pool that pays the miners direct from the Coinbase transaction. So most of the mining pools, what they do is that they don't pay the miners from the Coinbase transaction, right? They pay themselves. So if I'm a miner, I will pay that 3.125 BTC to me. Once that 3.125 BTC comes to me, then I will transfer it to the miners, right? What Ocean does is that they directly pay the miners from the Coinbase transaction. They don't take the custody of the Coinbase rewards even for a second. Directly, the moment a block is mined, immediately the rewards are split to the miners from the Coinbase transaction itself, and that's why their Coinbase transactions usually are more voluminous in size as compared to the other mining pools, right? So this is what the bug is. Let's just look at the PR and see where the issue was and how double space was being reserved for the Coinbase transaction. I believe it is here. Yeah, okay, see. So this is one place where we are reserving 4,000 weight units, right? So the default block max weight is what? It's the max block weight minus 4,000 weight units. The max block weight is what? It's 4 million weight units. So 4 million weight units minus 4,000 weight units. That is 3,992,96,000 weight units, right? So we reserve 4,000 weight units over here in this file, like in the source folder. Then you go to policy.h. Here we reserve 4,000 weight units for what? We reserve it for the Coinbase transaction, the block header, and the transaction quantity count. Then again, if you come to this file, types.h, again we are reserving 4,000 weight units. Coinbase max additional weight, right? We are reserving 4,000 weight units again for the Coinbase transaction. So we have already reserved 4,000 weight units above for the Coinbase transaction, and we are reserving 4,000 weight units over here again. So which means we are reserving a cumulative of how much? 8,000 weight units for the Coinbase transaction, whereas we intend to reserve only 4,000. What this does is that it deprives the miners of 4,000 weight units, right? Because now they cannot include 4 to 5 additional transactions that they could have had this 4,000 weight unit space be free. So this is what the bug is, that we are reserving 4,000 weight units here. We are again reserving 4,000 weight units here. That's 8,000 weight units, right? So this is a bug due to which you were not able to utilize the entire block space to populate a transaction. Even if you wanted to create a block of 3,996,000 weight units, you were not able to do that. The maximum that you could go up to is 3,992,000 weight units. Okay, so after this bug is fixed, we will only allocate 4,000 weight units. And if a miner is mining a block that has a Coinbase transaction, which who and the size of the Coinbase transaction is in excess of 4,000 weight units, then in that situation they can manually configure it using an PC command, or using a configuration flag. They can manually configure the size of the block, and whatever size that they have freed will be allocated to the Coinbase transaction, right? So yeah, and that is what this news article is about. It talks about a double space allocation bug in Bitcoin Core, and how miners were not able to utilize 4,000 weight units, and how if we fix this bug by stipulating an upper cap, then the miners that are creating Coinbase transactions in excess of 4,000 weight units will create invalid blocks. So the mitigation is that we allocate 4,000 weight units, but then we also give the miners a provision to configure the amount of space that they want to allocate to populate the transactions using a configuration flag. Right. Any questions or any observations for reading this specific news article before we move on to the next one? Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. And if none, I'll look at the chat. Nothing in the chat as well, it seems.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a bit confused about how block max weight fixes that issue.
How block max weight fixes. So
That flag.
okay. So if this PR gets merged and you use the default you use the default configuration of Bitcoin Core, you will be allowed to use 4,000 weight units for your Coinbase transaction and your transaction quantity count and your block header, right? And the remaining 3,996,000 will be allotted to uh, uh, what do you say? Populating the block with transactions, right? Now, if you want to create a Coinbase transaction in addition of 4,000 weight units. Let's say you want to create a Coinbase transaction of 5,000 weight units. So what do? Miners of pool needing more than 4,000 weight units for their Coinbase transaction should configure Bitcoin with a lower block max weight height option. For example, starting Bitcoin Core with block max weight height such and such will free up an additional 1,000 weight units, right? So you the default size for the Coinbase transaction will be 4,000 weight units. But if you want more than that, then you go to your let's say Bitcoin config file, and you set up the value of this Bitcoin block max weight manually, right? So if I'm a miner and I want to, and my Coinbase transactions are usually 5,000 or 6,000 weight units, what will I do? I'll go here and manipulate this value, right? I'll change it to 3,997,000, for instance. That will free up more space, right? So if you need, the default space will be 4,000, but if you want more than that, then you can change the value of block max weight height. And when you change the value of block max weight height, the lesser the value you stipulate, that amount of value will be freed for the Coinbase transaction. So if your value is this, then your Coinbase transactions value will be 5,000. If it's 99, if it's 98, then it's 6,000. If it's 97, then it's 7,000. That's how it works.
Also, if we decrease this block max weight, then the space for block template will also decrease.
Yeah, the block template, as in, yeah, by template, like the block is, we separate the block into two sections, right? One section is for the Coinbase transaction, for the transaction quantity count, and for the block header, right? And the
Right.
rest is for rest of the block, whatever remains of the block, right? So if you are allocating more space to this section, that is the Coinbase transaction, the header, and the block count, then you are reducing the space from the rest of the block. So that is how it is. You have to split it into two sections. The default is 4,000 weight units for this, and this amount for rest of the block. If you want more space for this goes down. More space for this goes down. And if you want more space for this, you use this command. Okay, and the more you reduce this value, the same amount of space will be allocated to this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. So if you look at this now, this how this is calculated. You have a max block weight and you subtract 4,000 from that, right? So if your max block weight is 4 million, then you subtract 4,000 from that. What is the remaining? 3,996,000, right? Okay. But if you want lesser space, then what do? Then you reduce this value. You reduce it to 3,999,000, and then when you subtract 4,000 from this, then 3,995 will be remaining, right? And then 5,000 will be freed for this,
Okay.
right? All right, cool. Let's move on to the next one. This is probably the last news article that we will cover, and then we'll probably cover one code and documentation change. Okay. Mm, this has to do with the Lightning Network. I'm assuming that the participants have a high level understanding of what Lightning Network is. If you don't understand what Lightning Network is, then I'm afraid you not understand what this news article is talking about. Let's just read through it. Multi-party LN symmetry variant with penalties for limiting published updates. Daniel Roberts posted to Delving Bitcoin about preventing a malicious channel counterparty, Mallory, from being able to delay channel settlement by deliberately broadcasting old states at a higher fee rate than an honest counterparty. Bob is paying for confirmation of the final state. In theory, Bob can rebind his final state to Mallory's old state, and both transactions might confirm in the same block, causing her to lose money on fees and Bob to confirm the final state for the same fee cost he was already willing to pay. However, if Mallory can repeatedly prevent Bob from learning about her broadcasts of old states before they are confirmed, she can prevent him from responding until HTLCs in the channel expire and Mallory is able to steal funds. Roberts proposed a scheme that allows a channel participant to confirm only a single state. If a later state, nah, no wonder I was reading the wrong article. That is why I was wondering how come it's not making any sense to me. Right, sorry. So we leave this one. Our contract level relative time locks. Gregory Sanders posted to Delving Bitcoin about finding a solution for a complication he discovered about a year ago when creating a proof of concept implementation of LN symmetry. In that protocol, each channel state can be confirmed on chain, but only the last state confirmed before a deadline can distribute the channel funds. Usually, the parties to a channel would attempt to confirm only the latest state. However, if Alice initiates a new state update by partially signing a transaction and sending it to Bob, only Bob can complete that transaction. If Bob stalls at that point, Alice can only choose a channel in its penultimate state. If Bob waits until Alice's penultimate state has almost reached its deadline and then confirms the last state, it will take approximately twice as long as the deadline for the channel to resolve, called, called the 2x delay problem. That means time locks for HTLCs in LN symmetry must be up to twice as long, which makes it easier for attackers to prevent forwarding nodes from earning income on their capital through channel jamming attacks and other problems. Okay. So briefly, we know what Lightning Network is, right? It's basically what we call as a layer two. It is a layer two for Bitcoin's base layer. Okay. Now there are two types of Lightning channel. One is known as unidirectional Lightning channel, and the other is known as bidirectional Lightning channel. What's a unidirectional Lightning channel? In a unidirectional Lightning channel, one of the two parties makes the payment, right? Payments, as the name suggests, are unidirectional. Only one person can pay. So if Alice opens up a unidirectional Lightning channel with Bob, then only Alice can pay Bob. Bob cannot pay Alice. All right. So the funds will only move in one direction. What's a bidirectional Lightning channel? As the name suggests, if Alice opens a bidirectional Lightning channel with Bob, then Alice can make payments to Bob and Bob can make payments to Alice. It's a bidirectional Lightning channel. Okay. Now, in the Lightning network, or the conventional or the contemporary way of how the Lightning network works, is that we have this concept in the Lightning network, which is known as LN penalty, which is known as LN penalty. All right. So, how do we establish a Lightning channel? We have this thing known as a funding transaction. So, if two participants or two participants want to set up a Lightning channel, they send their funds to a two of two multi-sig account on the base layer, right? Okay. They lock their funds in a two of two multi-sig account, and then they use the outputs of that two of two multi-sig account to spend on the Lightning channel, right? So every time a spending is made on the Lightning channel, the status of the Lightning channel or the state of the Lightning channel is updated, right? So let's say Alice and Bob wants to start a Lightning channel, a bi-directional Lightning channel. Both of them put one Bitcoin each in a two of two multi-sig account on the base layer, okay? And that transaction gets confirmed on the base layer. This is what we call as the funding transaction, right? So now what's the state? What's the initial balance? Alice owns one Bitcoin and Bob owns one Bitcoin, right? Now, if Alice wants to make a payment to Bob, right, of zero point 0.5 Bitcoin, right? What will happen? They'll make this payment on chain, on the Lightning Network. They'll not settle it on the base layer. Now, what is the latest state? The latest state is that Alice has zero point 0.5 Bitcoin and Bob has 1.5 Bitcoin, right? So we've updated the state. Initially, it was one Bitcoin each, but now we've updated the state, but we have not published the state on the mainnet. All of these transactions are happening on the layer two, right? We're not publishing it. We are not encrypting this on the decentralized Bitcoin blockchain ledger. Okay. Now let's say Alice makes another payment, okay, of zero point 0.1 Bitcoin, right? So now what's the third state? The third state is that Bob owns 1.6 Bitcoins and Alice owns zero point 0.4, right? It started with Alice 1, Bob 1, then it changed, the state updated, Alice 0.5, Bob 1.5, and then the state again updated, Alice 0.4 and Bob 1.6, right? Now, what if Alice broadcasted an earlier state, right? Now, when you want to close this Lightning channel, you broadcast the final state of the transaction. What if Alice broadcasts a transaction that is beneficial to her, right? The latest state is Alice 0 point 0.4 and Bob 1.6. But what if Alice broadcasts a previous state, right? What was the previous state? The previous state was Alice zero point 0.5 and Bob 1.5, right? Which was more beneficial for Alice because in the previous state, in the penultimate state, Alice had zero point 0.1 BTC more. What if Alice publishes and broadcasts the previous state to the blockchain, which is more favorable to her? Bob needs to have a mechanism in place to ensure that Alice gets punished in case she does that, right? So if you have a Lightning channel open with someone and they're trying to broadcast an old state or a stale state which is more beneficial to them, you need to have a mechanism in place to punish them, right? And this mechanism is known as an LN penalty. LN penalty. Without going into the intricacies of how this works, is that if Alice tries to broadcast a stale state, an old state that is more beneficial to her, and Bob detects that before the transaction gets confirmed, Bob can penalize Alice and take all the funds in the channel, right? So all two Bitcoins will go to Bob, right? It started with one Bitcoin Alice, one Bitcoin Bob, right? And then second state was 1.5 Bitcoin Bob and zero point 0.5 Bitcoin Alice. Third state was 1.6 Bitcoin Bob and zero point 0.4 Bitcoin Alice, right? Now, if Alice tries to cheat and broadcast an older state, which is more beneficial to her and Bob detects that, then Bob gets the the entire channel balance, right? Alice will be penalized, Alice will be punished, and all two Bitcoins will go to Bob. This is known as Ellen penalty, right? But it comes with its own set of drawbacks, right? It comes with its own set of drawbacks. Like your node always needs to be online. So Bob's node should always be online, and Bob's node has to constantly uh, search for the fact that Alice broadcasting a stale state, an old state. Bob's node always needs to be online. If Bob's node is offline and Alice broadcasts the old transaction, and by the time Bob's node comes back online, if that Alice's transaction gets mined, then that's it. There's nothing Bob can do that. It's irrevocable, right? So there is another mechanism or another proposal that is being worked on, which is known as L2. L2, which is also known as Allen symmetry. What will this do? The moment a new state is updated, the previous state gets abolished, or it kind of expires on its own, right? So at the moment Alice and Bob mutually agree with the latest state of the channel, in our example, Alice owns 1.6 Bitcoin and Bob owns Bob owns 1.6 Bitcoin and Alex owns zero point 0.4 Bitcoin, immediately the previous state becomes null and void, right? So it is not possible for any of the parties in a Lightning network to even think about broadcasting uh, an old or a stale state, right? Because that becomes irrevocable. I mean, that gets revoked. Okay, that gets confiscated. That old state is not valid anymore. The moment you update the state of the Lightning channel, the moment you update the balance, the previous state gets confiscated, right? So your node does not is not in need of constantly monitoring and then watching for whether it's being cheated or no, right? The moment you update the state, the previous state gets confiscated, it gets annulled, right? So this proposal is known as Allen symmetry. Let me see if the description is very small, then we can probably read it. Yeah, I think it's pretty small. L2, also called Allen symmetry, is a proposed enforcement mechanism for Allen that allows any later channel state to replace any earlier channel state. Although L2 can be used with a penalty mechanism similar to the one used with existing Allen channels, L2 doesn't need the penalty mechanism in order to be secure, right? So we discussed that currently, how do we punish cheaters on the Lightning Network? By penalty mechanism, right? So your node has to constantly look out for transactions that are being broadcasted by your channel partner, and the moment your node detects that your channel partner is trying to broadcast a stale or an old state, you penalize them, right? You catch them, you penalize them, and you become the beneficiary of all the channel balance, right? But L2, what how does L2 work? The moment a new state is agreed upon by both the channel partners, the previous state becomes annulled. The previous state becomes null and void. So there is no need of penalty. You don't have to constantly look out for whether your partner is broadcasting transactions which are stale. So you don't have to look for all of that, because the moment a new state is updated, the previous state automatically becomes annulled. So you don't need that penalty mechanism. If L2 is used without a penalty mechanism, there's no harm in publishing an old state, except that it costs transaction fees to publish. This makes it less dangerous to try to restore an L node from a backup after a sudden failure or some other problem. It also makes it much simpler for three or more parties to open a single L channel together, enabling features such as channel factories, right? So my reason of going through this pretext was that we understand how the Lightning Network works, right? And then we understand how the penalty mechanism in the current Lightning Network works, and then we understand and appreciate what L2 or Ln symmetry is trying to do. It's trying to get rid of this penalty mechanism in bidirectional channels, where instead of penalizing the cheater, you do not even allow the channel partner to cheat, right? You completely circumvent the possibility of a channel partner cheating. That's what Ln symmetry is. Okay, so there was a proposal made by Gregory Sanders recently. Up till now, we know that in Lightning channel, there are two transactions that go on the main net, right? Your funding transaction with which you start a Lightning channel, and your commitment transaction with which you end the Lightning channel. And everything that happens between the funding channel and the commitment channel stays on layer two. It is not published on the main net, right? It stays on the layer two. But there was a proposal made by Gregory Sanders to publish the state updates to the main net as well, right? So every single time a transaction is made on the Lightning Network, right, and the state or the balance of the Lightning channel is updated, you publish it on the blockchain. You publish it on the blockchain for whatever that use case could be, right? However, only the final state can be redeemed. Only the final state can be redeemed. So when you set up the transaction, right, you set up a time lock. Within that time lock, only the final state can be published. So let's say you make a payment, you update the balance of the channel, and you broadcast that transaction to the main net, right? You get that transaction mined on the blockchain. Then again, you make a payment. Again, you get that transaction mined on the blockchain. Then again, you make a payment. Then again, you get transaction mined on the blockchain. The catch here is that you cannot redeem, meaning you cannot spend the outputs. You cannot spend the outputs. Okay, only the ultimate or the final output you can redeem that, right? So let's say I set up a lightning channel with Alice, okay, and then I make payment one, I make payment two, I make payment three, I make payment four, I make 10 payments, right? And I every single time I update the state of the lightning channel, I broadcast it to the main net. I broadcast it to the main net, and I get that they get that transaction of the updated state mined on the blockchain. The catch here is that all the states 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up till 9, I cannot access the UTXOs. I cannot spend the UTXOs of all those states. Okay, they will just be encrypted on the decentralized ledger. They'll just be encrypted there as a record. The only UTXOs I can spend is the final transaction. Okay, is the final transaction. So I can set a time lock of, let's say, 1,000 blocks. Within those 1,000 blocks, every time a state is updated, that update will be registered on the blockchain, but I cannot access the outputs. Meaning I cannot spend the outputs on the mainnet. Only the final state that is registered on the blockchain before, let's say, that 1,000 block time lock that we have set, only that final state can be spent by the beneficiaries, right? So it's like a hybrid between the Lightning Network and the Bitcoin network, right? Where you update the state every once in a while, but that state update you cannot actually spend it on the main net, right? Um, Currently, what we do is that even those state updates are not registered on the blockchain, but this proposal allows you to register the state update on the blockchain, but you cannot spend them. You cannot spend them. You can only spend the commitment transaction. What's the commitment transaction in this context? It is the final state. It is the final state before a certain time lock is expired. So when you start a Lightning channel, you or every time you update the state, you set a time lock, right? You set your time lock. Within that time lock, the final state that you register on the blockchain is the one whose outputs you can access, and all the penultimate state or those states before that, even though they will be registered on the blockchain, you cannot spend them. Okay. Now there is a nice article about L2 on the internet which I came across with nice diagrams, which will probably help us understand better what how L2 works. Okay. So this is basically how L2 works. So you set up, let's say Alice and Bob set up a 2 of 2 multi-sig account, right? This is the funding transaction, and now they have a Lightning channel, right? Once they set up the account, they first create a settlement transaction. Okay, this refunds. So Alice and Bob create a Lightning channel. They put, let's say, 1 Bitcoin each in a 2 of 2 multi-sig account, and then they create a settlement channel which refunds them their funds. So 1 Bitcoin back to Alice and 1 Bitcoin back to Bob, and they sign it, right? So that if they don't ever update the state, they can at least use this transaction and broadcast it to the mainnet and get their refund back. Now, if they want to make a payment on the mainnet, let's say Alice wants to spend zero point 0.5 Bitcoin and give it to Bob. So what's the new state now? The new state is 1.5 Bitcoin to Bob and zero point 0.5 Bitcoin to Alice. So they update the state. Now, before they update the state, again, they sign a settlement transaction, right? Which sends 1.5 Bitcoin to Bob and zero point 0.5 Bitcoin to Alice. And then they update the state, right? So for every time you update the state, you have two transactions, right? Or you have two, yeah, you have two transactions. One is known as settlement transaction. The other is known as the update transaction. Okay. The difference is that the settlement transaction has a 10 block CSV time lock to it, right? So you can basically opt out of the Lightning channel in two ways. First is using the settlement transaction, which has a 10 block time lock, and the second is through the update transaction, which doesn't have a time lock at all, right? Now the catch here is that when you let's say this is the first state that you have updated, right? And there's the second state you have updated. Okay. Now when you update this first state, you are spending the outputs from U1. Okay, so when you create I-1, it is spending the outputs of U1, right? So when this is created, this becomes obsolete. So you can't broadcast an old state, right? So this is the first state, the second state, the third state. When you are creating the first state, you are using the outputs from this transaction, right? So this becomes obsolete. You're using the same output, so you can't double spend. So this becomes obsolete. So the counterparty on the Lightning network cannot broadcast this transaction. Earlier, what you used to do is that even if there are three states, even this is valid, even this is valid, even this is valid, right? This is how LN penalty works, right? So if there are three different states, this is valid, this is also valid, this is also valid, right? But this is the latest. So if somebody tries to broadcast this, you have to constantly check if they're trying to cheat. If you see that your partner is broadcasting an old state, then you catch them and you penalize them. What L2 does is that the moment you create this state, okay, the first state gets invalidated. So you can't even broadcast it. When you create this state, then the second state gets invalidated. So you can't even broadcast it. So there's no concept of penalty because the moment you create a new state, the previous state gets invalidated. You cannot even broadcast it. To to the blockchain. That's how L2 works broadly. Okay. Now, one problem with this is that if I mean the proposal that was made by Gregory Sanders is that it allows you to register each state on the blockchain, right? The contemporary or the conventional way of L2 is that you don't register these state updates to the main net, right? But there was a proposal made by Gregory Sanders that makes it possible for Lightning Network users to register each state on the blockchain. So this state you register on the blockchain, but you can't spend it. This state you register to the blockchain, you can't spend it. This state you register to the blockchain. If this is the final state, then only you can spend this. So these will be registered on the blockchain, but only the final state you can use to spend. What happens is that if you know how Lightning Network works, then you have this concept of HTLCs, right? You have this concept of HTLCs such that commitment transaction, a forced commitment transaction in the Lightning Network is time locked. It is time locked. Now, what can happen is that uh, so if this transaction is registered on the blockchain and it is time locked, and then you register this transaction on the blockchain, then it's time locked, the time lock of this transaction plus the time lock of this transaction. Okay, it'll get an adding, and then the third state will be time lock of this transaction plus the time lock of this transaction, right? So what this does is that this induces the problem of this double time lock. Okay, of the double time lock. So if there are two counterparties, Alice and Bob, right? Alice broadcasts this transaction. Okay, and let's say the expiry date or the expiry time for this transaction is, let's say, 200 blocks. So Bob can wait for 199 blocks, and then after that, Bob can broadcast this date. Okay. So now 199 plus again 200. So it'll become almost 399 blocks in our example for the transaction to get validated. So what somebody can do is that they can wait for their channel partner to broadcast this transaction on the net. Okay, and they know that this transaction can only be spent after 200 blocks, so they can wait for 199 blocks. After 199 blocks have been expired, have lapsed, then they will broadcast the latest date. Okay, and then after waiting for 199 blocks, then again they will have to wait for 200 blocks. Okay, so this is something which is known as the double, what do they call it, the 2x delay problem, 2x delay problem. So to circumvent that, what is the proposal? The proposal is that the time lock will be set at contract level and not at the level where you update the state, right? So the time lock will be set at this level. Okay, when you create your commitment transaction, that is when you will create a time lock. Okay, and the time lock will be valid throughout. So if Alice broadcasts this transaction, okay, and Bob waits for 199 blocks, and after that Bob broadcasts this transaction, then the time lock for this transaction will only be one. Okay, so when you set up and you decide that the contract level time lock will be for 200 blocks. Okay, and then this one is broadcasted the first state and 199 blocks have lapsed. After that, when you broadcast a new state, then the timer will not start again from one, right? It'll start from 199, and only after one block this state will be broadcasted, right? That is what the mitigation is. So in brief, this is what L2 is. Okay, L2 kind of tries to get rid of the penalty mechanism in the Lightning Network, because the penalty mechanism comes with its own set of drawbacks and overheads. Then there was a proposal. Okay, now let's remember that L2, the conventional L2, does not propose that you register every state update to the blockchain. It just works like the regular Lightning transactions work, right? So even in L2, all the states are updated on layer 2. Only when you want to settle, you go to the main net, right? But there is a proposal that was made for Gregory Sanders for a certain use case, whatever that might be, that you register every state update on the blockchain. However, only the final state can be redeemed. The outputs of the final state can be spent. So you apply a time lock. Okay, and within that time lock, all the state updates can be registered on the blockchain, but only the final state can be reaped, right? Now, this comes with a catch of a 2x delay problem, which we discussed, because the time locks are specific to each update state, right? So if you broadcast one update state and you wait till its time lock expires and then you broadcast another updated state, okay, the counter again starts from zero. So your amount of time that you will need to access your outputs keeps on compounding, right? So what is the solution? The solution is contract level time lock. So when you create an L2, when you create a lightning channel, in compliance with L2, you set up a contract level time lock. So there is no specific time lock for this, and then specific for this, and then specific for this. No, there's a contract level time lock, and it does not compound. So if this is broadcasted and you wait for 199 blocks and you've set a time lock of 200 blocks over here, and then you broadcast this, you just have to wait for one block. Okay, so it doesn't compound. That is what this proposal talks about. Basically, fix the 2x delay problem that could exist in this proposal of L2 mechanism for the Lightning Network. And this is what I had to share from my end. Okay. If you were not able to comprehend this completely, I understand, because you need to be very well versed with the Lightning Network. You need to know what the Lightning Network are. You need to know what Lightning Network is. You need to know what a funding transaction is. You need to know what a commitment transaction is. You need to know what the penalty mechanism is. You need to know what LN symmetry is. You need to know how LN symmetry circumvents the penalty mechanism. You need to understand this specific proposal of Gregory Sanders that allows you to publish updated states to the mainnet. You need to understand how relative time locks function. Then you need to understand what a contract level relative time lock is, right? So this article is an amalgamation of lots and lots and lots of concepts. And if you are not familiar with even one or two of them, then it will be very difficult for you to appreciate and comprehend this article. But no worries, even if you are able to get something out of it, then that's great. You still have time. You can go through this article at your own pace and try and understand if you're interested how Allen symmetry works. And if you have any queries or questions, please feel free to post in Discord, and anybody who's available would be more than happy to help you. And this video will also go to YouTube, so you can listen to it again. Maybe it'll make more sense to you um, at that time. And that is the reason why I was skipping the third article, because even this has a lot of intermingling of a lot of concepts, right? So I believe that the listeners might not be able to appreciate it. So we'll stick to the first two news articles. The first one about the mining pool behavior, the second one about the contract level time relative time locks in the L2 mechanism. And there's one code and documentation change that we will discuss. After that, we'll open it up for question and answers if you all have any. Okay, so let's just cover this in a couple of minutes, and then I'll stop sharing my scene. And if you all have any questions, then you all can ask those questions together and put them in the chat section. All right, let's just go through this one code and documentation change. Bitcoin Core PR28121 adds a new reject details field to the response of the test mempool accept RPC command, which is only included if the transaction would be rejected from the mempool due to consensus or policy violations. The error message is identical to the one returned by send raw transaction if the transaction is rejected there as well. So if any of you have participated in the learning Bitcoin from the command line cohort at Bitshala, or if any of you have ever created your own Bitcoin transaction, or any of you have tested any of the release candidates of the Bitcoin Core, then you probably might have used this RPC command send raw transaction. What is send raw transaction? As the name suggests, you create a raw transaction and you send it. That is, you broadcast it to the Bitcoin network, right? So if you're running a Bitcoin node, you want to create your own transaction and you want to broadcast your own transaction, you create the transaction, you sign the transaction, and then you send the transaction to the network, right? Now, if that transaction gets rejected for some reason, could be multiple reasons. It could be rejected, for instance, if it is not in compliance with any of the consensus rules, then you will get an error, right? You will get an error. Now, there is another RPC command known as test mempool accept. If you've created a transaction and you want to test whether the transaction will enter your mempool or it will not enter your mempool, then you can use this RPC command, right? So if there is a transaction, firstly, if it is not complying with the consensus rules, then it will not enter your mempool. Secondly, if it is not complying with any of your policies, then it will not enter the mempool. Thirdly, if it is paying a fee which is below the dust relay fee, then it will not enter the mempool, right? So you can create a transaction and you can test whether that transaction enters the mempool or not. Okay, so if you know that the latest version of standard transactions Bitcoin Core are known as V3 transactions, where even if a parent is paying a very low fee and you attach a child to it which is paying a high fee, then you can club them as one parent, one child package, and you can broadcast that, right? So you can do this testing. You can do this testing. You can create a parent transaction that pays a fee which is below the dust fee, and then you can check the test mempool accept, it'll reject. because it's paying a fee below the dust fee. Then you can create a child transaction which pays a high fee, and you can attach that child transaction to the parent transaction, and you can broadcast the entire package. And then when you trigger this RPC test mempool accept, then you see that that same transaction which was paying a fee less than the dust relief fee and was getting rejected and from your mempool now gets accepted because it's being relayed as a one parent one child package, right? So you can use this RPC command test mempool accept to check whether a transaction is entering your mempool or no. So now it comes with additional information, right? It adds a new field. So when it rejects, obviously, whenever you're using Bitcoin Core and you're creating transactions and that's, you get some error, right? You get an error log which tells you what the error is, right? So it basically comes in the form of a JSON object. More often than not, will come back. The error will be logged in the form of a JSON object, which has fields and values, which will tell you what the exact elaborate error is, right? So a new field has been added to that will get logged into your terminal, which is known as reject details, right? So if you trigger this command test mempool accept, okay, and if you are uh, passing as an argument a Bitcoin transaction to this command, which your mempool will not accept, you'll get an error. That error will now contain an additional field, which is known as reject details, right? Which is only included if the transaction be rejected from the mempool due to consensus of our policy violations. The error message is identical to the one returned by send transaction if the transaction is rejected, right? So this new field is added reject details, which obviously will give you details as the name suggests as to why the transaction was rejected from your mempool, right? So you can create a transaction, you can test it using the test mempool accept command to see whether that transaction is being accepted or rejected by your mempool. If it's accepted, great, you'll get a success output. If it's rejected, you'll get a field known as reject details that will elaborate or enumerate the reasons in detail as to why your transaction was rejected was exactly rejected from the mempool, right? So this is what I had to share from my end. I will stop sharing my screen now. Over you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Reject details. This would have been so helpful for the boss challenge. Would have saved me probably hours of debugging. Cool. Now this you can access what this PR is, Yogansh. This PR is 28181. You can go and build your Bitcoin core again. Like you can merge this specific PR in your Bitcoin core, and then you can build and configure your Bitcoin core again and incorporate this PR in your client, and then maybe you can use this for your testing purpose.